There is a word that has haunted human ambition since the beginning of consciousness. A word spoken by experts, by authorities, by those who claim to know better. A word that has stood at the threshold of every great transformation in history, daring us to turn back. That word is impossible. It's a curious word, really, because if you study the arc of human achievement, you discover something remarkable. The impossible has a strange habit of becoming inevitable. Flight was impossible, until it wasn't. Splitting the atom was impossible, until it wasn't. Landing on the moon was impossible, until it wasn't. The pattern repeats endlessly, revealing a profound truth about our species. We are at our best when we refuse to accept the limits others have drawn for us. This is a story about one of those moments, a moment when the world stood at the edge of catastrophe, when the experts said something couldn't be done, and when one man, a builder of dams who had never constructed a ship in his life, decided that impossible was simply another word for not yet. His name was Henry John Kaiser. And in the darkest days of the Second World War, he would orchestrate an industrial revolution that changed not just the course of the war, but the very nature of how we build, how we organize labor, and how we think about human potential. But to understand what Kaiser achieved, we must first understand the crisis that demanded the impossible. By the spring of 1941, the Allied cause was drowning, not metaphorically, literally, drowning in the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean. German U-boats, sleek, deadly submarines operating in coordinated wolf packs, were tearing through Allied shipping convoys with terrifying efficiency. Every day, merchant ships carrying food, fuel, weapons, and supplies were being sent to the bottom of the sea. Britain, isolated and besieged, was being slowly strangled. The Soviet Union, reeling from the Nazi invasion, desperately needed American supplies to survive. The mathematics of destruction were brutally simple. Ships were sinking faster than they could be replaced. Traditional shipbuilding was an art form, a craft handed down through generations. Master shipwrights would spend 18 months, sometimes 2 years, carefully constructing a single cargo vessel. Every plate was riveted by hand. Every section was built in sequence, one after another, with the patience of medieval cathedral builders. It was precise, it was proven, and it was catastrophically slow. Winston Churchill would later write that the only thing he truly frightened during the entire war was the U-boat peril, because he understood what the numbers meant. At the rate ships were being lost, Britain would starve before American industrial might could make any difference. The Allies were in a race against time, and they were losing. Roosevelt knew this. His military advisors knew this. And yet, when they looked at American shipbuilding capacity, they saw an industry trapped in tradition, incapable of scaling to meet the crisis. The old shipyards could barely increase production by 20 or 30%. What was needed was not incremental improvement. What was needed was a multiplication of capacity, a transformation so radical it seemed to defy the laws of industrial reality. Enter Henry J. Kaiser. If you had asked the established shipbuilders of America who should lead the nation's emergency ship construction program, Henry Kaiser's name would not have appeared on any list. He was an outsider, an interloper, a man whose resume read like a catalog of ambition but included not a single ocean-going vessel. Kaiser had built roads that snaked through impossible mountain terrain. He had constructed the Hoover Dam, one of the greatest engineering projects in human history, taming the Colorado River and pouring enough concrete to pave a highway from San Francisco to New York. He had built the Grand Coulee Dam, the Oakland-San Francisco Bay Bridge, and dozens of other massive infrastructure projects that reshaped the American West. He was a builder of the impossible on land. But ships? Ships belonged to the sea, and the sea had its own aristocracy. Men who understood hulls and keels and the ancient traditions of maritime construction. But Kaiser had something the traditional shipbuilders didn't have. He had a mind unconstrained by the word always, as in, we've always built ships this way,
or "It's always taken this long," or "You always need experienced craftsmen." Kaiser looked at shipbuilding and saw not a mystical art, but an engineering problem, a problem of logistics, of organization, of assembly. He saw it the way he saw a dam, a massive undertaking that could be broken down into components, systematized, and accelerated through innovation and parallel processing. When the Maritime Commission, desperate for solutions, approached Kaiser about building merchant ships, he did something that shocked everyone. He said yes, not tentatively, not with a long list of caveats. He said yes with the confidence of a man who had moved mountains and believed he could do it again. The traditional shipbuilders laughed. They actually laughed. Here was a man who couldn't tell a fore from an aft, who had never laid a keel, promising to revolutionize an industry that had been perfecting its craft for thousands of years. It was absurd. It was arrogant. It was, they said, impossible. Kaiser ignored them. He had heard impossible before. In the fall of 1940, Kaiser traveled to the Richmond shipyards in California, where the government was attempting to expand production. He walked the docks, watched the workers, studied the process, and what he saw appalled him. Not because the workers were incompetent, they were skilled craftsmen, many of them, but because the system was medieval. Ships were being built sequentially. The keel was laid, then the frame was constructed, piece by piece. Then the hull plates were attached, one by one, each one hand-riveted in place by teams of workers. Only after the hull was complete could work begin on the superstructure. Only after that could the engines be installed. Every step waited for the previous step to finish. It was like building a house by laying one brick at a time, waiting for the mortar to dry, then adding the next brick. Kaiser saw waste. Not waste of materials, but waste of time, humanity's most precious and irreplaceable resource. He saw workers standing idle, waiting for other workers to finish. He saw components being fabricated on site when they could be manufactured elsewhere and transported. He saw tradition masquerading as necessity. And then Kaiser did what great innovators always do. He asked a simple question. Why? Why did ships have to be built in sequence? Why couldn't different sections be constructed simultaneously and then joined together? Why were they using rivets, which required teams of skilled workers and created weak points where plates overlapped, instead of welding, which was faster, stronger, and required less skill? Why were components being fabricated on site when they could be fabricated in specialized factories where mass production techniques could be applied? The answers he received were variations of the same response, because that's how it's done. Kaiser hated that answer. He hated it with the passion of a man who had spent his life proving conventional wisdom wrong. So he made a decision that would change history. He would throw out the rulebook. He would build ships the way he built dams, through prefabrication, modular assembly, and the ruthless application of mass production principles. He called it the Liberty Ship Program. The name was not accidental. These ships would carry the cargo of freedom to a world at war. But the name also reflected a deeper philosophy: liberty from tradition, liberty from the constraints of the past, liberty to imagine a new way forward.
Kaiser's revolution began not at the shipyard, but in factories scattered across America. In steel mills, workers began cutting hull plates to standardized dimensions. In fabrication shops, sections of the ship, entire bow assemblies, stern sections, deck houses were welded together like giant three-dimensional puzzles. These prefabricated sections, some weighing as much as 200 tons, were then transported to the shipyard by rail. The shipyard itself was transformed into something that had never existed before: an assembly line for ships. Giant cranes, some of the largest in the world, were installed to lift these massive sections and position them with precision. The keel would be laid, yes, but within days, entire sections of the ship would be lowered into place and welded together. Work that had taken months now took weeks. Work that had required sequential precision now happened in parallel. But Kaiser's most radical innovation was welding. Traditional ships were riveted, a process where metal plates overlapped and were fastened together with thousands of hot metal rivets, each one driven home by a team of skilled workers. It was time-consuming, labor-intensive, and created structural vulnerabilities. Welds, by contrast, were faster, stronger, and required far less skill. A worker could be trained to weld in weeks, whereas becoming a master riveter took years. The old guard was horrified. Welding, they said, would make ships brittle. The welds would crack in cold water. The ships would break apart in heavy seas. They trotted out expert after expert to explain why this newfangled approach would end in disaster. Kaiser listened politely, then ignored them. He had engineers who ran the calculations. He had metallurgists who tested the materials. He had faith in physics and empirical evidence over received wisdom. And most importantly, he had a war to win. But ships aren't built by theories and innovations alone. They're built by people. Human beings who wake up before dawn, put on their work clothes, and pour their labor into steel and welding torches and rivers of sweat. And this is where Kaiser's revolution became truly extraordinary. America in 1941 had millions of workers, but most of them had no experience in shipbuilding. The skilled craftsmen who had dominated the industry for generations couldn't possibly scale to meet the demand. So Kaiser did something radical. He decided that ordinary people with minimal training could build ships. Not some ships, not simple ships, Liberty ships. 10,000-ton ocean-going vessels. Recruitment posters went up across the country. Build ships for victory, they proclaimed. No experience necessary. And people came. They came in numbers that staggered the imagination. They came from farms and small towns, from cities and mountains, drawn by the promise of good wages, by patriotism, by the simple human need to be part of something larger than themselves. Women came. Tens of thousands of women defying the convention that shipbuilding was men's work. They became welders, riveters, crane operators, electricians. They cut steel, assembled engines, climbed scaffolding, and proved day after day, shift after shift, that skill had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with training and determination. African Americans came, migrating from the segregated South to find opportunity in the shipyards of Richmond, California, and Oregon, and Washington. They faced discrimination. Yes, Jim Crow didn't disappear at the shipyard gates, but they also found possibilities that had been denied to them elsewhere. They became foremen, inspectors, skilled tradespeople. They helped build the arsenal of democracy, even as democracy continued to fail them at home. Migrants came from across America, drawn by the promise of jobs. The population of Richmond, California exploded from 23,000 to 100,000 in less than 3 years. Vanport City, built near Portland to house shipyard workers, became Oregon's second largest city almost overnight. A city of 40,000 people that hadn't existed before the war. These weren't traditional neighborhoods. These were industrial boomtowns, thrown together with the same speed and pragmatism that defined the ships themselves. And Kaiser, to his credit, understood that you couldn't just demand labor. You had to support it. He built housing, not luxurious, but adequate. He created cafeterias that served meals around the clock to accommodate the 24-hour shift work. And perhaps most famously, he created a comprehensive healthcare system for his workers, a prepaid health plan that would eventually become Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest healthcare organizations in America. He did this not out of pure altruism, but out of pragmatic wisdom. Healthy workers were productive workers. Supported workers were loyal workers. And speed required loyalty and health in equal measure. The training was intense, but brief. New workers would spend the few weeks learning the basics: how to read blueprints,
how to strike an arc with a welding torch, how to operate equipment safely. Then they were thrown into the chaos of the shipyard, paired with more experienced workers, and expected to learn by doing. It was industrial education at the speed of war, and it worked because it had to work. Richmond, California became the crown jewel of Kaiser's empire. The Richmond shipyards, eventually expanding to 4 separate yards, became the most productive shipbuilding facility in human history. Standing at the edge of San Francisco Bay, where mud flats and empty land had once stretched toward the water, there now rose a forest of cranes, a maze of railways, mountains of steel plate and slipways where the skeletal frames of ships took shape with astonishing speed. Walk through Richmond at the height of production, and you would witness an industrial ballet choreographed with military precision. Trains arrived constantly, their flat cars loaded with prefabricated ship sections from factories in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Kansas. Cranes swung these massive assemblies through the air like children's toys, positioning them with astonishing accuracy. Welders swarmed over the hulls, their torches creating constellations of sparks that lit up the night shift like earth-bound stars. The sound was deafening. Metal on metal, the roar of cutting torches, the percussion of pneumatic tools, and the blast of ship horns as another Liberty ship slid down the ways into the bay. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos. Kaiser had borrowed techniques from the automobile industry. Henry Ford's assembly line principles adapted for structures weighing thousands of tons. He had borrowed from construction, the parallel processing that had allowed the Hoover Dam to rise with unprecedented speed. And he had invented entirely new methods, solving problems that had never existed before because no one had ever tried to build ships this fast. The skeptics, meanwhile, continued to predict disaster. Traditional shipbuilders pointed to every small problem as proof that Kaiser's methods were fundamentally flawed. When early Liberty ships developed cracks in their hulls, the critics pounced. "We told you so," they crowed. "Welding makes ships weak. Kaiser's shortcuts are going to kill sailors." The criticism stung, but Kaiser responded with action rather than argument. He hired metallurgists to study the problem. They discovered that certain grades of steel became brittle in cold North Atlantic waters, causing stress fractures. The solution wasn't to abandon welding. It was to improve it. Higher quality steel was specified. Welding techniques were refined. Additional reinforcements were added to stress points. The problems were solved through engineering, not retreat. And the ships kept coming. One every 2 weeks from each slipway. Then one per week. Then faster. The pace was relentless, unforgiving, and absolutely necessary. Because across the Atlantic, U-boats were still hunting, and the arithmetic of war was clear. America had to build ships faster than Germany could sink them. Competition has a way of bringing out the best in people, and Kaiser understood this instinctively. He encouraged rivalry between his different shipyards. Richmond competed with the yards in Portland. Shifts competed with other shifts. Teams competed with other teams. Progress charts were posted publicly, showing which yard was ahead, which crew had set the latest record. Pride became a powerful motivator. And then in November 1942, something extraordinary happened. Something that would become the stuff of legend. Kaiser's Richmond Yard No. 2 decided to attempt the impossible. They would build a complete Liberty ship, from key laying to launch, in less than a week. Not because the war required it, not because there was any practical necessity, but because they could. Because they wanted to prove what human beings were capable of when they organized their efforts with precision and threw themselves into a task with complete commitment.
Newsreel cameras captured the moment. Newspapers around the world ran the story. It was a propaganda victory, yes, but it was also something more profound. Proof of concept. Proof that the impossible was merely difficult,
and that difficulty could be overcome through organization, determination, and belief. Now, it's important to note that the Robert E. Peary was a stunt, a demonstration build that drew resources from other projects. The average construction time for Liberty ships was closer to 42 days, which was still astonishing compared to the year or more that traditional methods required. But that 4-day record ship served a purpose beyond its own creation. It shattered mental barriers. It made people believe that maybe, just maybe, they could do things that no one had ever done before. Numbers can numb us. When figures grow too large, they lose their meaning, becoming abstract rather than real. But try to grasp this. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards built 2,710 Liberty ships, 2,710 ocean-going cargo vessels, each one capable of carrying thousands of tons of supplies, each one representing millions of hours of human labor, millions of pounds of steel, millions of welds, holding it all together. To put that in perspective, all the shipyards of the British Empire, at the height of their power, with centuries of maritime tradition behind them, built fewer than 500 comparable ships during the same period. The German yards, despite their engineering excellence, couldn't come close. Japan, despite being an island nation dependent on sea power, couldn't match it. America, led by a man who had never built a ship before the war, produced more merchant vessels in 4 years than the rest of the world combined. But the impact went far beyond mere numbers. What Kaiser and his workers achieved was a psychological victory, as profound as any one on the battlefield. They proved that industrial capacity wasn't fixed, it could be created. They proved that traditional methods weren't sacred, they could be questioned. They proved that ordinary people, given the right training and support, could achieve extraordinary things. Think about what this meant for the war effort. Every Liberty ship that reached Britain was a ship full of food that prevented starvation. Every ship that reached the Soviet Union carried tanks and aircraft that helped turn back the Nazi invasion. Every ship that supplied American forces in the Pacific was a logistical lifeline that made island-hopping campaigns possible. These ships didn't win battles directly. They didn't carry guns or drop bombs, but without them, the battles couldn't have been won at all. The U-boats kept hunting, yes. They sank hundreds of merchant ships throughout the war. But here's the crucial fact. By 1943, America was building ships faster than Germany could sink them. The mathematics of attrition had reversed. Every month, the Allied merchant fleet grew larger, despite the losses. The noose around Germany's neck tightened not just because of military victories, but because of industrial supremacy. Kaiser's revolution had turned the Atlantic from Germany's graveyard for Allied ships into a highway of supply that couldn't be severed. And there's something else these ships accomplished, something harder to quantify but equally important. They gave America confidence. They proved that American industry, American ingenuity, American workers could outproduce and outthink any adversary on Earth. That confidence seeped into everything, into the design of aircraft, into the production of tanks, into the entire war effort. If we could revolutionize shipbuilding, what else could we revolutionize? But let's not romanticize this story into simple patriotic mythology. Kaiser's revolution came with costs and complexities that deserve acknowledgement. The speed of construction sometimes led to quality issues. Some Liberty ships did crack in cold waters. A few even broke in half, though this was rare. The pressure to maintain production meant that problems were sometimes overlooked or addressed with shortcuts. The ships worked, and they served their purpose, but they weren't perfect. They were pragmatic solutions to an existential crisis, not eternal monuments to engineering excellence. The workers faced dangers that are easy to forget in the warm glow of historical hindsight. Shipyards were perilous places. Welding accidents, falls from scaffolding, crushed limbs from moving steel plates. Industrial medicine in the 1940s couldn't save everyone, and some workers paid the ultimate price for America's production miracle. The pace was exhausting. Shifts lasted 10 or 12 hours. The work was physically demanding in ways that would violate modern labor laws. People endured because the alternative, losing the war, was unthinkable. The social transformation, too, was incomplete and imperfect. Yes, women and minorities found opportunities in the shipyards. Yes, barriers were broken and possibilities were expanded. But discrimination didn't disappear. African American workers often faced segregated housing, unequal treatment, and glass ceilings that prevented advancement. Women were paid less than men for the same work. When the war ended, many women were pushed out of industrial jobs to make room for returning male veterans. The progress was real, but it was also fragile, easily reversed when the emergency ended. And yet, despite these complications, something fundamental had shifted. The genie couldn't be entirely put back in the bottle. Women had proved they could do industrial work. Minorities had proved they could master skilled trades. The mythology of male-only, whites-only technical competence was exposed as exactly that, mythology. The seeds for future civil rights movements and feminist waves were planted in those wartime shipyards, even if they wouldn't fully bloom for decades. Kaiser himself was no saint. He was a capitalist who made enormous profits from government contracts. He was an empire builder who sometimes put expansion ahead of worker welfare. He could be ruthless with competitors and demanding of employees, but he was also genuinely innovative, willing to challenge orthodoxy, and possessed of a democratic faith in human potential that was rare among industrialists of his era. He believed that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if you gave them tools, training, and trust. And he built his empire on that belief. The birth of Kaiser Permanente deserves more than a footnote in this story because it represents another revolution that emerged from the shipyard crucible. Kaiser recognized that workers couldn't be productive if they were sick, injured, or worried about their family's health. But in 1940s America, healthcare was expensive, unpredictable, and often inaccessible to working-class families. So Kaiser created something new, a prepaid health plan where workers paid a small fee from each paycheck and received comprehensive healthcare in return. He hired doctors, built hospitals and clinics near the shipyards, and created a system where prevention was as important as treatment. The idea was radical: healthcare as a right of employment, not a privilege of wealth. The model worked so well that after the war, he opened it to the public. Kaiser Permanente grew into one of the largest nonprofit healthcare organizations in the United States, serving millions of people. It pioneered integrated care, electronic health records, and preventative medicine approaches that are now standard practice. A healthcare revolution born from a shipbuilding revolution proved that innovation in one domain can catalyze transformation in others. This is the pattern throughout Kaiser's life: identifying a problem, questioning assumptions, and building systems that solve not just the immediate issue, but created lasting improvements. The ships were temporary. Most Liberty ships were scrapped within decades of the war's end. But the systems, the methods, the organizational principles survived. When the war ended in 1945, many predicted that Kaiser's shipbuilding empire would collapse. The emergency was over. The military contracts would dry up. The workers would return to their pre-war lives. The boom towns would become ghost towns. And in some ways, those predictions came true. Vanport City, the huge workers' community near Portland, was largely abandoned after the war and then catastrophically destroyed by a flood in 1948. The Richmond shipyards downsized dramatically. Millions of Liberty ships were mothballed or sold for scrap. But the knowledge didn't disappear. The methods didn't disappear. The proof that ships could be built with mass production techniques, that prefabrication and welding and parallel assembly worked, that became part of the permanent knowledge base of human civilization. And here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. In the decades after World War II, Japan and South Korea emerged as global shipbuilding powers. These nations, rebuilding from the devastation of war, studied American wartime production methods. They looked at Kaiser's revolution and asked, if Americans could build ships this way in an emergency, why can't we build ships this way all the time? They adopted prefabrication. They adopted welding. They adopted assembly line principles. They added their own innovations, better steel, more efficient designs, and continuous improvement processes. And they transformed global shipbuilding. By the 1970s, Japanese and Korean shipyards were producing the majority of the world's commercial vessels, using principles that Kaiser had pioneered 3 decades earlier. This is how revolutions spread. The innovator breaks the paradigm, proves the concept, demonstrates the possible, Then others take that knowledge, refine it, improve it, and build something even more sophisticated. Kaiser's Liberty ships were crude by modern standards, but they were the proof of concept that made modern shipbuilding possible.
The principles Kaiser employed extend far beyond ships and shipyards. They're the principles that underlie modern manufacturing, from automobile production to smartphone assembly to modular construction. Break complex products into components. Build those components in specialized facilities using mass production. Transport them to assembly locations. Use parallel processing to minimize time. Train workers in specific tasks rather than expecting universal craftsmanship. Standardize wherever possible. Question every assumption. Measure everything. Iterate rapidly. These ideas seem obvious now, but they weren't obvious in 1940. Or rather, they were obvious in some industries, but not in others. Kaiser's genius was recognizing that principles proven in one domain could be transferred to another. He saw shipbuilding through the lens of dam construction and automobile manufacturing, and that cross-pollination of ideas created something entirely new. Modern construction is beginning to embrace similar principles. Modular housing, where rooms or entire floors are built in factories and then assembled on site, uses the same logic Kaiser applied to ships. The advantages are identical: speed, quality control, reduced labor costs, weather independence. The challenges are similar too: transportation of large components, coordination of complex assembly, resistance from traditional craftspeople. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The just-in-time inventory systems pioneered by Japanese manufacturers in the 1970s and 80s echo Kaiser's approach to logistics. Don't store vast quantities of materials on site. Coordinate delivery so that components arrive exactly when needed. Minimize waste. Maximize flow. Kaiser wasn't the first to think this way, but he was among the first to apply these principles at the scale of multi-thousand-ton ocean-going vessels. And perhaps most importantly, Kaiser understood that innovation requires faith in people. The traditional shipbuilders believed that only master craftsmen with decades of experience could build ships. Kaiser believed that motivated people with a few weeks of training could build ships. Both were right in their own contexts, but Kaiser's context, total war requiring unprecedented production, demanded a different approach. He believed in human adaptability, in the capacity of ordinary people to learn, to rise to challenges, to become more than they thought they could be. And his workers proved him right. There's a philosophical dimension to this story that transcends the specific facts of ships and statistics. It's about how progress happens. How do societies advance? How do we move from what is to what could be? The answer, historically, involves someone looking at the status quo and refusing to accept it as permanent. Every field has its gatekeepers, its experts, its traditions. And traditions exist for good reasons. They encode centuries of hard-won wisdom. They prevent the repetition of past mistakes. They provide stability. But traditions can also become prisons, trapping us in patterns that made sense once but no longer serve us. Innovation requires irreverence, not the shallow irreverence of someone who rejects expertise out of ignorance, but the deep irreverence of someone who understands the tradition and chooses to question it anyway. Kaiser understood construction. He studied shipbuilding. He wasn't ignorant of why things were done the way they were done, but he believed he could do better, and he had the courage to try. This is where most innovations die, not in the laboratory, but in the meeting rooms where committees decide whether to pursue new ideas. It's safer to say no. It's safer to stick with proven methods. If you innovate and fail, you're blamed.
If you maintain the status quo and fail, well, everyone else was doing the same thing. Kaiser succeeded partly because the crisis was so severe that failure seemed impossible through traditional means. The catastrophe of losing the war was so much worse than the risk of trying something new that the calculation changed. But we don't always have the luxury of crisis to force our hand. Often, we need to choose innovation when the status quo seems adequate, when the risks of change seem to outweigh the benefits, when the voices of caution outnumber the voices of ambition. This is the harder test, and it's one that individuals, companies, and societies fail more often than they pass. Kaiser showed that revolutionary change is possible in mature industries. Shipbuilding in 1940 was not some nascent field waiting for its first innovations. It was thousands of years old, refined by countless generations, seemingly perfected, and yet it could be transformed. What does that tell us about other industries, about healthcare, education, government, energy? What traditions are we maintaining not because they're optimal, but because they're familiar? There's a deeper lesson here about capacity. Before Kaiser, the world believed there was a fixed capacity for ship production. X number of shipyards, Y number of skilled workers, Z ships per year. These were treated as constraints, as given facts about reality. Kaiser revealed that capacity isn't fixed, it's a function of organization, will, and imagination. This has implications that echo through economics, through military planning, through any domain where we talk about limits. How often are limits real, and how often are they failures of organization or imagination? When we say we can't house the homeless, or we can't transition to renewable energy, or we can't provide universal health care, or we can't reform education, how many of those can'ts are like the shipbuilders saying you can't build a ship in 40 days? Genuine physical constraints or organizational failures disguised as limits. This isn't to say that all limits are illusory. Physics is real. Resource scarcity is real. There are genuine constraints. But Kaiser's example suggests that we should be very, very skeptical of claims that something is impossible, especially when those claims come from institutions that benefit from maintaining the status quo. The Liberty Ship program cost billions of dollars, public investment on a massive scale. Modern arguments about what government can or should do often invoke efficiency and market principles. But here was a case where government investment, coordinated effort, and subordination of profit to purpose achieved something that pure market mechanisms couldn't have achieved. The private shipbuilders were perfectly efficient at building ships the old way. They had no incentive to revolutionize their industry. It took a crisis and government intervention to catalyze the transformation. This suggests that certain kinds of progress require collective action at a scale that only societies, not individuals or companies, can muster. The challenge is identifying which problems require this approach and which are better solved through decentralized innovation. Kaiser's revolution worked because there was a clear goal: build ships faster, and unlimited resources to pursue it. Not all problems have such clarity. Let's return to the human dimension one more time, because ultimately this story is about people, not just processes. Among the hundreds of thousands of workers who built Liberty ships were countless individual stories of transformation. A woman who had been a school teacher became a master welder and discovered talents she didn't know she possessed. A young man from rural Arkansas found purpose and community in the organized chaos of the shipyard. A black family escaped the suffocating racism of the Deep South and found dignity, imperfect and incomplete, but real, in the industrial West. These individual transformations were as important as the ships themselves, because when the war ended and the shipyards closed, Those people carried forward the knowledge that they were capable of more than society had told them they were. The woman who welded Liberty ships didn't forget that skill when she was pushed back into traditional female roles. The black workers who mastered skilled trades didn't forget their competence when confronted with continued discrimination. The seeds of future social movements were planted in these wartime experiences. Kaiser himself understood, at least partially, that he wasn't just building ships, he was building a workforce, a community, a social experiment. His support systems for workers weren't pure altruism, but they weren't pure cynicism either. He seemed genuinely to believe that if you treated workers well, trained them properly, and gave them purpose, they would surprise you with their capability. And he was right. This philosophy stands in contrast to approaches that treat workers as interchangeable cogs, that minimize investment in training and support, that extract maximum labor for minimum compensation. Kaiser,
Standing on the deck of one of these preserved ships, you can feel the ghosts of the past. The welders who joined these plates, the crane operators who lifted these sections, the young sailors who crossed oceans in these hulls, knowing that every moment at sea carried the risk of a torpedo. The ship becomes a time machine, connecting us to a moment when the world hung in the balance and ordinary people became extraordinary. Kaiser himself lived long past the war, dying in 1967 at the age of 85. He continued building hospitals, aluminum plants, housing developments. He remained restlessly innovative until the end, always looking for the next challenge, the next problem that everyone said was unsolvable. But the Liberty ships remained his defining achievement, the proof that his philosophy of aggressive innovation and faith in human potential could work at civilization scale. In the decades after his death, his reputation ebbed and flowed. Sometimes he was remembered as a visionary, sometimes as a profiteer, sometimes forgotten entirely, his achievements overshadowed by military heroes and political leaders. This is the fate of many industrialists. Their work is too technical, too unglamorous to compete with battlefield drama in the popular imagination. We remember Eisenhower and Patton, but we forget the people who built the equipment that made their victories possible. But history has a way of reassessing. As we face contemporary challenges, climate change, pandemics, infrastructure decay, technological disruption, Kaiser's example becomes relevant again. We need people who can organize massive undertakings. We need systems that can scale rapidly. We need faith that ordinary people, properly trained and supported, can solve problems that seem insurmountable. We need the courage to question traditions that no longer serve us. The Liberty Ship program cost approximately $2 billion, enormous at the time, though modest by modern standards of government spending. But consider the return on that investment. The ships helped win the war, which preserved democracy and prevented totalitarian domination of the globe. They proved that industrial capacity could be created, not just inherited. They advanced manufacturing techniques that benefited countless industries. They provided employment and opportunity to millions. They gave America confidence in its ability to mobilize and solve large-scale problems. What contemporary investments might yield similar returns? What modern equivalents of the Liberty Ship exist? Unglamorous but essential, requiring innovation in organization rather than pure technology, demanding faith in human potential. Infrastructure rebuilding, renewable energy transition, pandemic preparedness, climate adaptation all share characteristics with Kaiser's challenge. All require us to move faster than conventional wisdom suggests is possible. All demand that we question assumptions about capacity and timelines. There's a moment in the documentary footage from the shipyards that captures something essential. A young woman, maybe 20 years old, is welding a seam on a Liberty ship hull. Her face is intent, focused, protected by a welding mask. Sparks cascade around her like fireworks, and when she lifts the mask, her expression is one of quiet pride. Not arrogance, not boastfulness, just the satisfaction of someone who has learned a difficult skill and done it well. That expression appears again and again in the archival footage, on the faces of crane operators positioning massive hull sections with millimeter precision,
on the faces of inspectors checking welds, on the faces of workers watching as another Liberty ship slides down the ways into the water, their work made manifest in thousands of tons of functional steel. That's the human core of this story. Not the statistics, though they're impressive. Not the engineering innovations, though they're significant. But the transformation of people who didn't know what they were capable of until someone gave them the opportunity to find it out. Kaiser's genius wasn't primarily technical, though he hired excellent engineers. It wasn't primarily financial, though he managed money well. His genius was psychological and organizational. He understood that human beings rise to meet expectations, that capability is often a function of opportunity, and that the distance between impossible and done is usually shorter than we think. This is a profoundly democratic insight. It rejects the notion that only a special class of people, the experts, the educated, the experienced, can tackle difficult problems. It suggests that with proper organization, training, and support, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. This doesn't mean expertise is worthless or that experience doesn't matter, but it means that lack of traditional credentials shouldn't be a barrier when the stakes are high and the need is urgent. The Liberty Ship program transformed not just American industry, but American identity. Before the war, America was still emerging from the Depression, still questioning whether democracy and capitalism could compete with the apparent efficiency of totalitarian systems. The Soviet Union was rapidly industrializing. Nazi Germany seemed to have achieved economic miracles. Many wondered whether liberal democracy was obsolete, whether the future belonged to authoritarianism. The Liberty ships helped answer that question. They proved that free societies could organize, could mobilize, could outproduce and out-innovate anyone. Yes, the government played a coordinating role. Yes, there were elements of command economy during wartime. But the innovation came from individual initiative, Kaiser's willingness to challenge tradition, workers' willingness to learn new skills, engineers' willingness to try untested methods. This matters because the same question keeps reoccurring. Can open societies solve big problems? Can democracies make the hard choices and sustained commitments that large-scale challenges require? Or do we need authoritarian efficiency? Kaiser's example suggests that openness to innovation, faith in human potential, and willingness to question authority can be sources of strength, not weakness. The authoritarian model says experts will tell you what to do and you'll do it. The Kaiser model says we'll give you tools and training and purpose and you'll figure out the best way to do it. One model assumes people are machines to be programmed. The other assumes people are problem solvers to be empowered. Kaiser bet on empowerment and won.
It's worth noting what Kaiser didn't do. He didn't wait for perfect conditions. He didn't demand that all obstacles be removed before starting. He didn't insist on having all the answers before beginning. He started with an audacious goal, gathered resources, hired smart people, and learned by doing. Mistakes were made. Problems were solved. The work continued. This bias toward action, toward learning by doing rather than planning until perfect, is characteristic of successful large-scale projects. The Hoover Dam wasn't built by people who had built dams that large before. It was the first of its kind. The Manhattan Project wasn't led by people who had built atomic bombs before. It was unprecedented. The Apollo program wasn't run by people with experience landing on the moon. It was impossible, until it wasn't. Great achievements require a certain comfort with uncertainty, a willingness to commit before all risks are known, a faith that problems will be solvable when encountered. This is terrifying for institutions built on risk management and careful planning, but it's essential for breakthrough achievement. Kaiser demonstrated another crucial principle: speed matters. Not just for the obvious reason that faster is better, but because speed creates its own advantages. When you move fast, competitors can't keep up. When you move fast, problems don't have time to metastasize. When you move fast, people stay energized and focused. Momentum is a powerful force. The Manhattan Project was completed in under 3 years. The Liberty Ship program went from concept to mass production in similar time frame. Apollo went from Kennedy's speech to footprints on the moon in 8 years.
Modern LEGO projects often take decades, mired in environmental reviews, permit processes, budget negotiations, political changes. We've lost something of Kaiser's urgency, his willingness to accept imperfection in service of speed. Sometimes this is good. We care more about environmental impact, worker safety, community input than we did in 1942. But sometimes it's paralysis disguised as prudence. Sometimes perfect becomes the enemy of good, and good becomes the enemy of done. Finding the right balance is one of the great challenges of contemporary governance. There's a counter-narrative to consider, a darker reading of Kaiser's achievement. One could argue that the Liberty Ship program succeeded only because of unique wartime circumstances that can't be replicated. Total government support, unlimited funding, a workforce willing to accept harsh conditions, an enemy so evil that any sacrifice seemed justified, a suspension of normal market mechanisms, environmental concerns, and labor protections. This critique has merit. We can't and shouldn't try to recreate 1942 conditions. We can't ignore environmental consequences or worker safety. We can't command an economy the way wartime allows. The specifics of Kaiser's situation were indeed unique, but the principles remain applicable. The idea that capacity can be created through organization, the insight that ordinary people can be trained to do extraordinary work, the willingness to question traditional methods, the understanding that speed sometimes matters more than perfection, the faith that difficult problems can be solved if you commit sufficient resources and attention. These principles transcend the specific historical moment. The question isn't whether we can replicate 1942. The question is whether we can extract the lessons of 1942 and apply them to 2025 and beyond. Can we create urgency without war? Can we mobilize resources without command economics? Can we innovate rapidly while respecting rights and regulations? Can we move fast without being reckless? These are hard questions, and there are no universal answers. But Kaiser's example suggests that we often underestimate what's possible, that we accept constraints too readily, that we confuse tradition with necessity. Even accounting for all the unique advantages he had, Kaiser achieved something that most people thought was impossible. That achievement should make us question what else we might accomplish if we tried. Let's talk about legacy in its fullest sense. Kaiser left behind ships, though most are gone now. He left behind companies. Kaiser Permanente continues to serve millions. He left behind infrastructure, dams, bridges, roads that still function. But his most important legacy is conceptual. He left behind proof that radical innovation is possible in mature industries. He left behind evidence that human potential exceeds what we typically demand of people. He left behind a model of how to organize large-scale efforts. Other industrialists of his era, Ford, Edison, Carnegie, Rockefeller, are better known. They built corporate empires that still dominate their industries. But Kaiser's influence was different. He didn't create enduring monopolies. He created methods that were copied and improved by others. His achievement was to show what was possible, and then the world moved on, taking his lessons and building on them. This is perhaps a purer form of legacy, not control, but influence, not ownership, but inspiration. Kaiser didn't try to patent his shipbuilding methods or create barriers that prevented others from copying them. He proved a concept, and then the concept became part of human knowledge, available to anyone who studied it. The Liberty ships are gone, but the world they helped create remains. The post-war global order, with all its flaws and complexities, was shaped by Allied victory in World War II. That victory depended on logistics, on the ability to project power across oceans, to keep armies supplied thousands of miles from home. The Liberty ships were the logistical backbone of that effort. They're as responsible for the shape of the modern world as any battle or treaty. Think about that the next time someone dismisses logistics as boring or treats infrastructure as unglamorous. The exciting stuff, the battles, the breakthroughs, the dramatic moments, depends utterly on the boring stuff working reliably. Kaiser understood this. He knew that winning wars required building ships, that building ships required organizing workers, that organizing workers required creating systems of support, everything connected. Nothing was too mundane to matter.
We live in an age of extraordinary challenges. Climate change threatens global stability. Pandemics reveal the fragility of our systems. Infrastructure crumbles from decades of deferred maintenance. Inequality grows. Political divisions deepen. The list of problems can seem overwhelming, paralyzing, designed to make us throw up our hands in despair. Kaiser's story offers an antidote to that despair. Not a simple one, not a naive, we can do anything if we try platitude, but something more nuanced and more powerful. A proof that seemingly insurmountable challenges can be met if we organize our efforts intelligently, if we question assumptions courageously, if we invest in people generously, and if we move with urgency and purpose. The problems we face aren't necessarily easier than the ones Kaiser faced, but they're not necessarily harder either. Building thousands of ships in a few years seemed impossible until it was done. Transitioning to renewable energy seems daunting until we remember that entire industries have been transformed before. Housing every person seems financially impossible until we remember that we built entire cities to house shipyard workers in months. Providing universal health care seems politically unattainable until we remember that Kaiser created a healthcare system for his workers that still serves millions. This isn't to minimize the difficulties. Every challenge has its own unique obstacles, its own political complexities, its own technical hurdles. But Kaiser's example reminds us that what seems impossible is often just difficult, and difficult is achievable if we commit to it. The world doesn't need more people telling us why things can't be done. Every innovation in history has faced a chorus of experts explaining why it couldn't work. The world needs more people like Kaiser, people who hear impossible and think not yet, who see limits and wonder if they're real, who believe that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary achievements. There's a photograph from the Richmond shipyards, taken in 1943. It shows a Liberty ship in the final stages of assembly, surrounded by scaffolding and cranes. But what makes the photo remarkable is the people. Dozens of workers are visible, scattered across the hull and deck, each engaged in their specific task. Women and men, young and old, different races and backgrounds, all working together toward a common purpose. They didn't know they were making history. They thought they were just doing a job, earning a paycheck, contributing to the war effort. But history is made by people who show up and do the work, who learn new skills, who take pride in craftsmanship, who believe that their contribution matters. History is made by welders and crane operators and inspectors as much as by generals and presidents and industrialists. Kaiser understood this. He knew that his vision meant nothing without the people to execute it. He knew that prefabrication was just the concept until workers made it real. He knew that the distance between blueprint and reality was filled with human effort, human skill, human determination. And he organized his entire enterprise around that understanding. This is the final lesson, that progress is a collaborative achievement, not the work of lone geniuses. Kaiser gets the name recognition, the biographical treatment, the historical credit. But the Liberty ships were built by tens of thousands of people whose names are forgotten, whose photographs are lost, whose stories have dissolved into the past. They deserve to be remembered too. They were the revolution, made flesh and sweat and welding torches and calloused hands. So, what is Henry Kaiser's legacy? It's not the ships, though they changed history. It's not the companies, though they continue to serve. It's not the infrastructure, though it remains functional. Kaiser's legacy is a challenge and an invitation. The challenge: to question the limits we accept as given. To ask whether impossible means genuinely impossible or merely difficult and unprecedented. To demand evidence for claims that something can't be done. To be skeptical of expertise that protects the status quo rather than pushing toward progress. The invitation: to believe in human potential. To recognize that ordinary people, given training and opportunity and purpose, can achieve things that seem to require extraordinary people.
to build systems that empower rather than constrain, to organize efforts that multiply individual capability into collective achievement. Kaiser proved that one person with vision, resources, and determination can catalyze transformation that reshapes the world. But he also proved that such transformation requires thousands of people willing to learn, to work, to contribute their piece to a larger purpose. Both are necessary. Neither is sufficient alone. We stand now at our own moment of decision. The challenges we face, environmental, economic, social, technological, require solutions at the scale of Kaiser's achievement. We need to build sustainable systems as urgently as Kaiser built ships. We need to train workers for new industries as rapidly as Kaiser trained welders. We need to question assumptions as boldly as Kaiser questions shipbuilding tradition. We need to believe in collective capability as strongly as Kaiser believed in his workforce. The tools are different. The technologies have advanced. The specific challenges have changed. But human nature remains constant. We are still capable of extraordinary achievements when we organize our efforts intelligently and commit ourselves fully. We are still able to learn, to adapt, to solve problems that seem insurmountable. We are still at our best when we refuse to accept impossible as a final answer. Henry J. Kaiser built dams that tamed rivers, bridges that spanned bays, and ships that crossed oceans. But his greatest construction was less tangible and more enduring. He built proof, concrete, undeniable, historically verified proof that the impossible is merely difficult, and that human beings, working together with purpose and vision, can make the difficult look inevitable. The Liberty ships have largely vanished from the seas, melted down and recycled into new forms, their atoms scattered into the ongoing stream of civilization. But the lesson they embodied remains, waiting for each new generation to rediscover it, to apply it to their own challenges, to prove once again that we are limited only by our willingness to question limits. Kaiser showed us that capacity is not fixed, but created, that tradition is not sacred, but questionable, and that ordinary people, given the chance, will astonish you with what they can accomplish. That lesson, more than any ship or dam or company, is his true legacy. In the end, progress belongs to those who accept the world as it is, but to those who insist the world can be better and then roll up their sleeves and prove it.